All right. Today I am speaking with Eliza Mondegreen, and thank you so much for being here to talk with me, Eliza. It's nice to see you today.
It's good to see you too.
So I really am excited to speak with you because you have been exploring the world of what's going on with gender very deeply, and you've spent a lot of time writing about this and kind of teasing it apart and analyzing what's happening. And I feel like I've touched on that topic with several guests that I've had on
Mhm.
this channel, and we've had conversations around it. But we haven't really gone into the details of what's happening, like what is W path, what is going on, and the arc of the modern gender narrative. And so I'm hoping that maybe you can help kind of walk me through that a little bit. But first of all, would you mind giving an introduction for yourselves for anybody who's not familiar with your work?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a graduate student, researcher, and writer, and I got interested in the topic of gender. Um, I suppose I've always been interested in the topic of gender. I got interested in the topic of gender identity like 7-ish years ago. And like so many people who got interested in the topic of gender about 7 years ago, I fell down a rabbit hole and have been reporting from down there ever since.
So that would have been about 2016.
Yeah, that would have been about 2016.
What was it that happened in 2016 that brought it to your awareness?
It had been on my radar for several years that there was just something unusual or something that didn't feel quite right. And in 2016, a couple of things happened that brought it much closer to home. Um, Both like within my friend group, within my work, within every time that I would try to talk about, anything to do with women's rights. I had noticed that what was on the margins in 2013 or 2014 when I first noticed it was all of a sudden like every single time you would talk about women, there would be this push to clarify, do you mean all women? Like, do you include all women? By which they mean, do you include men?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And and so there were a lot of reasons that it came much closer and that I was finally, it was like, okay, there had been several years that I had been wondering what was going on and not looking deeply into it. And that was the year that I was like, okay, I have to understand what's going on here.
And it's interesting that you took that approach to it, because I think so many people hear this stuff and sort of start to just absorb it, and it becomes, as you know, this phrase I keep hearing lately, like the water that we're swimming in, instead of really
Mm-hmm.
taking the time to say what is this, what how do I understand this cultural phenomenon.
Yeah. And I think that there had been a period of time where I was absorbing it and then I realized I didn't really know what those things meant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that was always going to bother me eventually.
So what
My
did
hope is it
you
would always bother everybody eventually, but
yeah,
we haven't gotten there for some people yet.
yeah, that's a good point. I guess we all have a threshold.
Yeah, presumably it's out there
Presumably.
somewhere.
So what was it that you did with that curiosity?
um, the first thing that I did was that I just I went online, and at that time I went on. There was a story by Michelle Goldberg that used a word that I had been called many years before that had not meant anything in particular to me and had not and continued to not mean anything particular to me after I had looked it up, which was that I had been called a TERF
Okay.
in a women's group um, for questioning some priorities of that group. And I had looked it up and it was like trans exclusionary radical feminist, and I just had no idea. Like it was basically devoid of meaning for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I saw it again in this Michelle Goldberg piece. And this was maybe in 2015, but it gave me somewhere to look in 2016 where it was just like, okay, who are these people? Am I really one of these people?
Yeah.
Are they really it was hard because I think I had a lot of conditioning that I still see operating with a lot of friends and colleagues where I felt very, very nervous about kind of you kind of know when you're stepping out.
Mm-hmm.
And I was nervous about that, but I was more curious than I was nervous.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reading, I found the Reddit subreddit group Gender Critical, which has now been, of course, erased from the internet.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, in the summer of 2020. It was part of like there was this push on Reddit to remove what they called a bunch of hate subreddits, and so
Mm.
I think that's when they got rid of the Donald subreddit, and they got rid of a whole bunch, but they also took that opportunity to nuke Gender Critical,
Mm.
which it takes an interesting definition of hate for that to qualify.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
for sure. I mean, it's definitely a
yeah,
massaging of the word
yeah,
at best.
yeah.
I have never been on Reddit. And so,
Mm,
yeah, and I was out of it. I mean, like out of the cultural loop to an
okay,
extent at that time. So this wasn't creeping into my awareness at that point. It was more 2019, 2020 before I
okay.
really kind of realized
What would you say got your attention in like 2019, 2020
school, going back to
school?
graduate school. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. Definitely. I mean, they're probably like around 2017, 2018, there was some racial stuff on Facebook that was weird. I saw the phrase white
Hmm.
privilege for the first time. And I thought, this is strange. These concepts are they're so reductive, you know?
Yeah.
And, but the gender stuff, I don't know if I was aware of it to that extent at that point.
Yeah.
But you were in graduate school at the time, or were you an undergrad?
No, I was working in the nonprofit sector, the progressive nonprofit sector. And so I was deeply immersed in, it's interesting. Like the organization that I worked for when I started in like 2012,
Mm-hmm.
they did fairly concrete, but generally quite small things
Mm-hmm.
that had some kind of impact in the material world. And by the time I left, it was like, it was just all like language games and white guilt. And like, there was just nothing material left.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, it's like it loses its substance and it's just caught up in
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
arguing with itself over these things.
Yeah. It
Mm-hmm.
lost the ability to like make any difference in the world, however small, and exchanged it for the ability to make everybody feel bad all the time.
Mm-hmm. When you say language
Which,
games, I, I
oh,
I first think of
yeah.
like the UW inclusive language guide and then the inclusive
Yes.
language that Stanford put out, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely that kind of thing. Um, so I did a lot of writing for this organization, and every time I would send something out, someone on staff, and usually the same person, would respond and with suggestions and with helpful resources about how to say things a little better. And I think that my favorite one was when she dinged me for a very basic like grassroots advocacy email about like a policy proposal, and it was like, okay, I just needed a headline. I've always been bad with headlines, and I put like stand up for whatever in the headline, and she was like, this is kind of ableist, and I was like, did you literally stand up when you read the email, or was it a metaphor? Like,
Oh my gosh.
yeah,
Stand up was ableist.
yeah,
Wow. That seems like I, so I wrote this little parody after I saw the UW inclusive language guide.
mm-hmm.
And it was like, you can get down to the point where just language itself is ableist. So we shouldn't write. And then
Yeah,
gestures, that's ableist too. I mean, every single thing you can end up just like, okay, go sit in your corner. Don't.
yeah. And it really does in these kind of environments. It really becomes this competition of like who has the most sensitivity to any possible slight.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point. It's like a
Yeah,
sensitivity competition.
yeah. It's like a sensitivity arms race where you can like demonstrate it by being more offended by something that's even stupider and more abstruse.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow. That's so true. And
yeah,
it's like a demonstration of your, I don't know what your true social justice mindset or something.
yeah. And just that you have this kind of superior sensibility, sensitivity.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
So I was in that world for a long time,
yeah,
and
you were
I don't
really
really
in
miss it.
it.
Yeah.
Did you have to deprogram your thinking, or were you always kind of watching this happen and going, "What the heck is this?" and how do I speak to it?
That's a good question. I think I think what happened is there were a couple of places where I kind of noticed myself getting pulled by the current, and it alarmed me and like was kind of a wake up call. And I think that kind of that aversion to going with the current, which is maybe just like being, kind of a loner, not a joiner type
Mm-hmm.
personality. And you never know what exactly it is that keeps you out of these things. But I never went along very much. I was always kind of like the wry observer who was like, that's weird.
Mm.
But it was definitely when I left, it was interesting to just be able to talk a lot more freely because I couldn't be fired anymore.
Mm. Mm. Okay, so you
Yeah.
had this sense of having to hold back while you were there, and then when you left, you felt free in that regard.
Yeah. Because you really do feel like you're being, you have coworkers on your social media accounts and you feel like you're kind of being surveilled.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So amidst all this, was it gender that really stood out to you as something that was particularly you were particularly curious what is going on here or particularly concerned about?
Mm-hmm. Yes, because it was based on something like I could definitely be disturbed by dynamics in other areas. Like a lot of the like anti-racist stuff, like, okay, well, we need racism, positive like anti-racist discrimination tomorrow to make up for racist discrimination yesterday. Like, of
Mm-hmm.
course, that stuff is alarming. Um, but it is based on a real history of like racial discrimination. And the thing that was so alarming to me about the gender stuff was that it was just not true. Like there was just nothing there. And so it had this kind of like gravitylessness that I found really scary and that I was probably kind of primed to pick up on because my fascination as a kid and as a college student had always been on like totalitarian regimes and things that are not true.
Mm-hmm. So
I
when you
think that,
say, would
yeah.
you say a little bit more about that? I'm really curious. Like when you say that it wasn't true and there was like nothing, it was baseless. What was it that how did you realize that? What was it about it?
One of the things was having a lot, like hearing a lot of people who I knew personally
Mm-hmm.
and who I knew to be, generally good, if not, brilliant people was hearing people say things like, okay, trans women are women, and you're just trying to understand why they're saying that, and you ask them what they mean by it, and
Mm-hmm.
they have no idea, but it's very important to say.
Mm-hmm.
And running into a lot of things like that. And so many of the claims and demands of the kind of the trans activist movement would have this detachment from reality where like you couldn't, there was no possibility of like fact checking what people
Mm-hmm.
were saying or of reconnecting it to,
It
you
was
know,
almost like a statement of faith at that point.
it was a statement of faith. And it made me very nervous to see politics and culture moving boldly into that realm of just like pure faith statements. I
Mm-hmm.
think factuality is a pretty important basis of like a liberal society.
Do you think that people had sort of when in that statement, trans women are women, do you think there's a sort of mental schema of the trans woman and what is that and how does that mesh with reality?
I don't, I still don't know exactly what people are saying when they say that. I think what they are saying is because language creates reality, it's very important to put into the world that like we see trans women as women. And it's very
Mm-hmm.
important for people not to say trans women are men because of language constructing reality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the thing that made me so uncomfortable was, I had studied language in totalitarian regimes, and I had studied, and I'd always not studied right. I've never studied writing, but I'd always loved to write. And so,
Mm-hmm.
the way that I understand language, it's nothing like that. It's like, okay, language, you can make things more or less clear.
Mm-hmm.
And that can have real world consequences because you can enlighten or confuse people or mislead people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the same thing as language literally constructing reality and language literally making men into women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that was the big clash for me, was just being like, language doesn't work like that, but you can sure as hell confuse people and manipulate people and go to bad places. And yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It has a very because I said so feel to it.
It does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something that I've noticed about a lot of women who are interested in gender is kind of having a history of experiencing like coercive control in a relationship, especially in a romantic relationship, and noticing those same dynamics of like, because I said so, and if you don't, I'll kill myself. Like, if you have seen that before, and I've seen that before, like you are going to recognize it when you see it again, even if it put on lipstick and a dress and calls itself like a social movement.
Wow, that's a powerful statement.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that J.K. Rowling talks about. It's something that I would really be curious if it were possible to like survey the entire like gender critical population of women, like how many are in that boat. For how many was that part of like, okay, putting the pieces together and being like, something is not right here.
Like it's just a gut level. I recognize this.
Yeah.
This is not right.
Right. Like I have been through this before. I have seen this before. Yeah.
And so that's kind of where you were just kind of reacting to this and saying no, that this you can't construct this reality. And this would have been what 2019-ish at this point. After you
that would have been much earlier that I felt that way. But I don't know. I mean, the approach that I'd kind of taken publicly in the time that I was still at the nonprofit was, if you have a target and the center is the thing that you really want to talk about, but you can't because you get fired, that you kind of like, you shoot all around the target and you'll hit everything that's like related to it. And so I would talk about other social contagions. I would talk about other culture-bound syndromes. I would talk about women's rights, and I wouldn't use the language that I was supposed to use. Like I was trying to I would talk about totalitarian language games. I would talk about medical scandals, and I would just, I kind of felt like I was dropping all of these hints, and I wasn't sure if anybody was picking them up, and I didn't feel like I could be much more explicit. And I also I felt at that time that even just kind of non-participation in the fictions that like gender requires, like that felt conspicuous. And I would write posts, or I would write things for my work, and anytime they were about women, I would like I said, I would just get challenged about it. It was like nothing could be about women. And when I would say, do you notice what's happening here, which is that nothing is allowed to just be about women, people would there was this amazing incomprehension of what I could possibly mean by that, even when I would try to be speaking quite clearly. And I found that strange too.
It's interesting that came right after, I guess, the Me Too thing.
Yes, I find that interesting.
Yeah, it's like, did one lead to the other? I mean, the Me Too thing was really quite astonishing in some ways also, because it had a totalitarian aspect to it as well. Like there's only one way to talk about this. And even if you could largely agree with what was being said, there was definitely an orthodoxy, and there was a way to address this. Yeah.
And there was definitely not a universal, but a widespread contempt for things like, okay, due process, and was this person actually guilty of this thing? Or are we making him an avatar for every man who's mistreated you? Yeah.
So at the time when you were having these conversations, was it primarily in your just your smaller social media group, or had you started the process of really writing to a larger audience at that point?
No, it was really just talking to friends and coworkers. talking to my family.
And when did you start to, did you, I'm curious about the beginnings because at this point you have been writing to a much larger audience. Did your writing just start to pick up steam? Did people start to see what you were writing, or did you? What was that process like of speaking to this issue on a broader scale?
Um, how it actually started was I was dating this philosopher very briefly, and he was he was a nice guy. He was a little pedantic, as they, sometimes tend to be. Uh, and we had run into this huge conflict over the trans issue. And we had been writing each other back and forth these really long emails between the two of us.
Oh.
And we had been writing each other back and forth these really long emails. And I would get back these emails that didn't engage with anything that I said. And I would try to engage with the things that he said. And that was the point where I was just like, okay, I've put way too much work into this for only this blockhead to see it. And so I just started like turning those things into Twitter threads. And this was in 2019. And yeah, I think like very slowly on Twitter, like you will find people and people will find you. And yeah.
So you'd done all this work of really addressing his points and doing this deep analysis, and you're like, well, he's not even seeing this.
Right. It's just like, it's totally wasted on him. And it was the first time that I, like, given how much I had talked about it and how much I had especially thought about it in my own head, that was the first time that I'd like taken the trouble to like write it out. And yeah, I didn't want it to go to waste. So that was how my writing for the public about gender started, was romantic disappointment.
That's really interesting. Gender out of romance.
Yeah.
So during this time, was it prompted by trying to address these points that he was making and that culture was making, that you kept seeking more clarification and more understanding of the gender? What do you even call it? The gender movement? What do you call this thing that's happening?
I don't have a special name for it. The name that I picked for my Substack was like gender hacked. So kind of how gender hacked like our culture and our institutions and like our own psyches, because it's this incredibly compelling kind of idiom of distress.
Idiom of distress.
Yeah. So that's a term from like psychiatry. It's basically like at any given time or place, there will be a lot of people who experience distress for a lot of different reasons. And in the culture, there will be this kind of pool of symptoms that everybody draws from, and this pool of like metaphors to make sense of that suffering that everybody draws from. Okay. And things can be added to that pool, and things can kind of drain out of the pool over time as they lose kind of cultural salience.
Wow. Okay. Wow. I love that concept. That's so interesting.
Yeah, me too.
Wow. And it really does. I'm writing that down because that concept makes so much sense. And I love that there's a word for it and a way of thinking about it.
Yeah. And it's like, when you think about something like the idea of being born in the wrong body is an explanation for like a very deep sense of wrongness that somebody might feel throughout their life.
Yeah.
Like it's an incredibly compelling metaphor. And the problem is when the individual, and then especially when like the medical system takes that really literally instead of taking it really seriously, because to take it really seriously would be, okay, you're not born in the wrong body because that's not a thing, but you're having this really deep feeling of like disconnection or disassociation or, having trouble making connections with other people, whatever it is that's going on that, a doctor needs to care about and your friends and loved ones should care about, but that we shouldn't take too literally.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to get into that, but I also want to know, I'm also really curious about, just your further explorations of this, because I think that you're in a position, you've put yourself in a position to really understand the arc of what's happening very well. And that, I guess, the medicalizing of this, it's so interesting that it's this internal experience. And it seems like there's a discrepancy, but we don't understand whether it's psychological or medical, even in
Mm-hmm.
the medical field, in the psychology and medical arena, because we've got these psychologists and counselors who are just writing a letter based on very,
Yeah.
I mean, they've got like the Gallup project, which is this letter writing project where we pledge to just write letters for anybody who says they're trans or
Yes.
non-binary. We just pledge that.
Yes.
Here's your directory of people that you can go to for a letter, like guaranteed. Self
Or walk up to this tent at a pride parade and we'll write you a letter right now. Yeah.
Exactly. So then that's not psychological at that point. That's just saying we don't want to block your access to care. And what is
Yeah.
care? It's consumer cosmetic medicine. It's just a
Yes.
consumer product, like we or service. Like you can come and get these things done. But then the backdrop for all of this is you're so psychologically distressed that if you don't get this consumer medicine, then you'll kill yourself, that
Yeah.
your distress will be so unbearable. And so we must provide you this access, but we also can't address it from a psychological. I mean, so this just seems like a
Yeah.
morass of confusion.
Yes. Yeah. I think when you touch upon the suicide risk, like I think that is, or the suicide narrative, I would say, I think that is the piece that really binds everybody, like binds patients. I've heard so many people, like I've heard people in real life, friends of mine who transitioned. I've heard people online. I've heard people that I've met through this say like they really did believe that if they didn't transition, they would kill themselves.
Because they were told that?
Because they were told that, because that's the narrative in these communities. And that the suicide narrative was a reason to not even wait to be sure about transition.
Wow. So even for the individual themselves,
even for the individual, that it was, yeah. I mean, especially when we're talking about, people who are young and impressionable and like really having, struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that there are a lot of people, it's a narrative that can certainly be leveraged manipulatively, but a lot of people really buy into it who are patients. And doctors buy into it, and it skews every risk calculation because, you can do anything to a patient and it's better than the patient killing themselves.
Right. It's like a harm reduction thing at that
point. Right. It's like, okay, well, we could block their puberty. And honestly, we have no idea what the long-term impacts of that are, but at least they won't kill themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like that's the argument. Mm-hmm. And then of course they use it against parents to basically to beat hesitant parents into compliance. And they use it against the society. Where it's like, okay, don't ask too many questions about this. Like,
we're saving lives.
Right. We're saving lives. And it's also like we've had legislators on the floor of, US state houses. And I think also on the floor of the parliament saying things like that a political debate would cause young people to take their lives, which is not a great suggestion to make to young people.
Yeah. And that's what you're saying is that the culture pushing this narrative is encouraging young people to adopt this stance. It's not coming from within. It's not coming from the young person unprompted.
I mean, I wouldn't say we don't know if it ever, comes unprompted. I'm sure in some cases it does. But yes, young people in this community are primed with this narrative about being at a high risk of suicide. And the data is not really there. Like, there's the absolute risk of suicide from the studies that exist. Like it's very low. And it's on par with, the rate of suicide for people with serious mental health conditions, which I would argue, gender dysphoria is one. And it's not at all on the scale where it would be like, okay, we should throw out everything that we know about, the scientific process and child development and all of, we've kind of thrown everything overboard for this narrative that isn't really grounded in reality. And I think that has greased the skids for a lot of very bad medical practice. And it has excused a lot of things that we would not accept in any other area of medicine, like just blocking a kid's development because they want you to, because they don't think that they are the thing that they are. Yeah.
Yeah. And that blocking development, the puberty blocking drugs, what do you know about the long-term impacts of that on the body?
So Nobody knows really long term.
Okay.
So this is a class of drugs that has had many uses. So they're in stage prostate cancer drugs, and in stage because they are nasty in terms of their
So
effect on the body.
that's what they were developed for, end state or
I think that that is what they were first approved
okay.
for.
End stage
Was
prostate cancer.
end stage prostate cancer.
Okay.
They've been prescribed for endometriosis, but typically only for periods of up to 6 months
Because they're
because
harmful.
the side effects can be so debilitating.
Wow.
These kinds of drugs have been used to chemically castrate sex offenders. And they've also, like, I think, as far as I'm aware, the pool of kids who were given these at about the age that gender dysphoric kids are given them, although usually for less time, are, young women about my age who were given them in the late 90s or the early 2000s for precocious puberty.
Okay.
And they're now in their, 30s, late 20s to mid 30s. And there's a great stat news story that kind of follows the negative health consequences that some of these young women have experienced from taking puberty blockers. And, it'll be like you're in your 20s or your 30s and your jaw is shattering or your hip is shattering because your bone density has been, your puberty is when you are supposed to be like adding bone density that will last you for the rest of your life, or at least you sure hope so. And so there are young women with osteoporosis. There are effects on mental health. There have been reported effects that it would lower IQ, effects on memory, effects on, I think there have been like reported seizures. And the few studies of gender dysphoric kids on these drugs, Michael Biggs has untangled some of this. Like, for all of the claims about these drugs buying time and helping to mitigate the stress that kids feel as they're facing down what doctors would call, the wrong puberty, which is just puberty. Michael Biggs looked and he was like, okay, for girls in particular, like the time that they were on blockers, their mental health declined, their self-harm went up. Like these are drugs that are not functioning and fulfilling the promise that they're supposed to within this area of medicine. They're not buying time. They seem to be locking kids into this like lifelong pathway of taking, moving on to cross-sex hormones, being infertile if they have, never gone through normal puberty. And, we're just creating this whole generation of guinea pigs. And I can't remember who said this, but somebody said, I'd call it an experiment, except with an experiment, you're supposed to track the outcomes. And that's mostly not happening.
It's not happening.
Yeah.
So these are serious drugs that were developed and used for very serious conditions. And you said that there was a group of women who received these in the 90s at some point, a group of young girls who were being treated with some of this class of drugs for precocious puberty. But in tracking the outcomes for those people, we noticed some serious problems with their long-term health, or their, I guess it's medium.
Not even that long-term.
It's only been not even 20 years, really. Well, maybe 20 years.
Probably about 20 years. But, these are people who should be in the prime of their life and are having kind of, that the falling apart health that someone might experience in their 80s.
And so these are, just looking at that alone. Yeah. It seems like this is a very serious intervention to take with someone. And if there were a way to help that person without using that, you'd want to do that.
You would think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's the age of children? And do you know the stats on, or any kind of, do you have a sense of how many people are being treated with these right now?
So I don't remember the numbers from the UK, which, has a centralized health system that it's much easier to track this stuff. In the US, I'm not sure that anybody knows. Reuters did some reporting on kids transitioning, but they had access to like one health insurance database. And that surely doesn't include, people who are publicly insured, people who go through, who pay privately. I don't think we know.
Okay.
If anybody does know, let me know.
Yeah, I'd be curious about that information.
Yeah, me too.
And a lot of times when we think about interventions for gender
Mm-hmm.
affirmation, as they call it. And just going back, something you said about going through the wrong puberty. That's something I've heard a couple of times recently. I've heard people saying
Mm-hmm.
things like going through puberty without consent,
Yes.
like phrases like this, that like you have to consent to a body process. It's like I just don't even know. I'm at a little bit of a loss for words thinking
Yeah.
about the linguistic leaps that you have to take in order to reframe it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Wrong puberty, non-consensual puberty.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is trying to shift kind of the onus of medical responsibility from, okay, prove that an intervention is safe to prove that non-intervention, that not blocking puberty is safe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like, this is definitely something that, um, when I went to the World Professional Association for Transgender Health conference, when I went to the European version, those kinds of claims and that attempt to kind of shift the burden of proof were really front and center.
Will you talk a little bit about that organization? So
Yeah,
that's
sure.
WPATH, World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and that sounds really official. I mean, that sounds like that must be the place to go to get really good scientific information.
Yeah, as Stella O'Malley has said, it self-identifies as the professional association for, transgender health. Yeah, so this is an organization that formed in the 1970s, and it's gone on an interesting journey over time. The main product that it releases and the main way that it disseminates its views about kind of trans healthcare is that it creates these standards of care. And these are standards of care that are referenced by doctors and medical associations and governments when they're making policy all across the Western world,
How
maybe
did
more
they
broadly
get
than
to
that.
be in that position of being thought of as the standard?
So I'm not an expert on the kind of the history of WPATH, but
Mm-hmm.
my sense is that there was nobody else who was filling this
Okay.
function.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
And the Harry Benjamin Society, and then later WPATH, like that's the same organization over time, like kind of steps in and fills that, and like Stella says, like self-identifies as
Mm-hmm.
the authority on this subject. Um, and the standards of care are certainly interesting. They at the European version of WPATH that I went to a couple of months ago, part of the opening plenary was this long defense of the WPATH standards of care and comparing it to other standards of care for things like HIV, which of course you can diagnose with a test,
Mm-hmm.
unlike a transgender identity or gender dysphoria.
Mm-hmm.
And the comparisons were almost completely like quantitative, where it would be like, okay, well, the HIV standards of care looked at this many articles and has this many citations and had this many reviewers, and we had more of all of those things.
Okay.
So there's like what I would say is like they're really trying to provide the appearance of science, and it's not necessarily the practice. And so in that way, it's a lot like transition.
It's like
It's
idea
like
laundering.
it's idea laundering, but it's also like, okay, we can't actually change your sex, but we can give you this appearance of the opposite sex. And it's like, okay, well, we're not actually like doing science and engaging with criticisms, like, but we're going to give you like the very convincing appearance, the most convincing appearance that we can put on of doing that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's how it seems to me.
Okay. Yeah, it's very analogous.
It's very analogous, and they will be very clear when they are talking about the standards that they put together, about the things they didn't consider.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say like, we didn't consider any research, any evidence whatsoever that doesn't take in like gender identity as a natural human variation, which means anything that suggests that maybe gender dysphoria and transgender identity aren't kind of these that this isn't a deep part of being human, that this might be, a symptom of something else. Like none of that was considered.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So they actually address that. They actually say that.
Right. they don't address it in a way where they're saying, by the way, we're biased. They address it in a way where they're like, well, of course we wouldn't consider that stuff.
Mhm. Okay. Do
Yeah.
they endorse, do they explicitly endorse these interventions with young people?
I certainly the idea that they are appropriate for some young people.
Okay.
Like in the last standards of care, they removed all age limits for kind of hormonal interventions and surgeries.
Mm-hmm.
They talk a lot about assessment and very little about how you would actually tell the difference between a child who might benefit and a child who wouldn't benefit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and they do give some time to the idea of assessment, which seems like that is just not being done in these letter writing things, but I don't know how much that applies to minors.
Yeah. So I don't know about the letter writing. I would guess that
might
you
be
have
for
to be
adults.
over age.
Okay. Okay.
Just because it seems incredibly risky even for this field.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I think even people who have, even clinicians who have concerns that, you know, maybe affirmation isn't the right approach for every single patient will really struggle to clarify, you know, what assessment can you use to determine who will benefit?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody seems able to answer that.
Mm-hmm.
And so no matter what kind of concern a clinician expresses about, you know, some patients being transitioned inappropriately, if they can't answer that question about assessment, how do they know that they're not doing the same thing, but with fewer kids?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And with WPATH's standards of care, what do they say about social transition? Do they have any thoughts on that? Is it free for all or?
I'm trying to, I can't remember that right off the top of my head.
Okay. I'm wondering.
I would say in general,
it's being used so frequently and it's being implemented. In fact, I just spoke with a family who were considering a particular school for their child, told the school before beginning at this school. So my child is wanting to identify as the opposite sex and trying to use a different name. But our family is working with a counselor and we're not doing that right now. We're not doing that route. The school explicitly told the parents, no, we will be respecting the child's and actually used the opposite sex pronoun in the letter to respond to the parent. The child had never met these people. They'd never assessed the child in any way. Their school, they don't really, how do they have the qualification to make that assessment at all? But just on the parents' word that this was happening, the school intervened on behalf of the self-diagnosis that the child was making. So it just seems like social transition is this very big thing that's happening willy-nilly everywhere. And I wonder what the standards are around this.
I don't remember what the standards of care say specifically about social transition, but I've talked to affirmative clinicians about social transition, and there were also sessions at both of these conferences about social transition. And with a few exceptions, most of these affirmative clinicians don't seem to take social transition very seriously.
Okay.
In terms of, they don't think of it as a serious psychosocial intervention.
Okay. So it's just if the kid wants to do it, do it.
Right. If the kid wants to do it, do it. And that it would be bad and that there wouldn't be any reason to hold off.
Okay.
So I think that there's not an appreciation of the way that kind of coming out publicly, asking everybody in your kid's life to like lie to your kid about their sex.
That seems like it violates so much.
Like these seem like pretty big decisions, and it seems like it makes it really hard for a kid to change their mind.
Right.
And they'll often talk about it in a way where they like make it seem there's a lot of minimization in the way that these clinicians talk about what they're doing. And so they'll talk about social transition that includes changing names and changing pronouns. And they'll make it mostly about like, well, of course you would let them like cut their hair however they want and play with whatever toys they want. And it's like, this is not the same thing. Like one of these is unloading, you know, the innocent preferences that a child might have for a certain like way to present and a certain toys to play with and their favorite playmates and their favorite storybook characters. And the other one is asking everybody in a child's life to lie to that child. and to enlist all of the other children in that child's life in this fiction.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. But the minimization is so interesting. Like, I know that you've seen this too over the last couple of months, as gender affirming care has become kind of a dirty word in the US, mostly because, Republican legislators have dragged gender affirming care kind of into the public eye in a way that it wasn't here before. That the proponents of gender affirming care will define ever more innocent and ever more uncontentious things as gender affirming care, like telling a girl that it's okay to have long hair and wear a dress is gender affirming care.
It's a false equivalency.
Yeah. This is what you do when you do not want the public to understand what you're doing.
Sorry, I got noisy on my end right now. I don't know if you can hear that. Oh gosh.
It sounds like somebody's backing up into your house.
There's a church parking lot next door, and I guess they must be doing something. So anyway, sorry about the noise.
It's okay.
So I guess I'm curious, how are you feeling about where this is right now? Do you feel like we're going to move through this? Do you have a sense of optimism, or do you feel like we're still slogging through it? What do you think is going on in terms of the broader social movement? Are people waking up to the dangers of this?
I think that a lot of people are waking up to the dangers of it. For a lot of people, that's because the issue has really come home. Somebody that they love is identifying as transgender, and as soon as that happens, like, it makes it very difficult to believe the things that you're supposed to believe about gender identity and transition when somebody who you are close to, who you know very well, who you love, kind of adopts this identification. It's like, okay, this isn't being authentic. And, it's never somebody who's in a great place in life and is like, and also I realized that I'm really a man. Like, that's never how it happens. And you so often watch people who adopt a transgender identity, like, really deteriorate kind of mentally, like social interactions become more hard, like everything becomes more fraught. And that's really a wake-up call, and all the more so when it's a parent with a kid. Like, I think that it's coming home for a lot of parents as their kids are picking this up. So I think more people are starting to understand what's going on, and at the same time, the thing that I'm worried about is how much will public opposition matter, because kind of the elite and institutional buy-in is so strong, and the social media censorship apparatus is so strong. If you play with these like open AI systems, you can see, if this is the search engine of the future where you ask a question and then it tells, rather than giving you a bunch of results that you can sort through and say, okay, this seems legit, this doesn't, like, it'll just give you an answer. These have been programmed in such a way that it's very chilling.
Okay, so they're supporting. There's support on one side that they're kind of creating a certain narrative, even in the search engines.
Yeah, that these AI, like, it's clear that programming has been written that, like, returns affirmation as the answer, rather than returning a variety of results that someone can assess for themselves, no matter how, no matter how skewed the stack or whatever. And so
that means that any authorities of reference are going to be supporting this thing longer than, so even if you get a lot of people questioning this, it's not necessarily going to be easy to shift things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it'll be an interesting test, I suppose, maybe a grim test of how much public understanding and public support matters. And I don't have a sense of how that's going to go.
Is there anything that makes you feel optimistic? And it's okay if there's not. I don't want to force you to be optimistic, but I'm curious.
I do think that I've kind of said something like this before, and I'm still going to hold on to it. I think that just as self-censorship is kind of a vicious cycle, and the more people who censor themselves, the more kind of the language constricts, the more the possibilities of, like, discussing something constrict. I think when people are more open, when people try to speak clearly, like that's pretty contagious too. And I think that as more people start speaking clearly about gender, that is going to disinhibit other people to be like, okay, this didn't quite seem, this is the conversation that I've had dozens and dozens of times with people one-on-one where they'll be like, I did have a lot of concerns and I thought that I was the only one who felt that way. And the more people speak out, the less people are going to feel isolated in their totally normal response to a movement that is sterilizing kids and silencing women. And, yeah, the more people are going to feel comfortable calling that what it is. So I am hopeful about that. And it's going to be an interesting test of kind of the people versus the versus institutional capture.
It's David versus Goliath.
Yeah.
So, and in speaking with people who, and that's one of the things do we talk to, and how do we talk about it? Like ideologically captured people or ideologically programmed or whatever. It seems like there's a lot of ways to talk about this that seems sort of condescending. Like I'm sitting here in this place where I know things that you don't clearly know, but there also is a sense of that. There is a sense that people who are enthralled to some of these ways of thinking are deliberately not taking in the whole picture or deliberately blocking out certain bits. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So how do you communicate with people, and do you communicate with people who are in that position?
So I have in the past communicated with people in my own life who were in that position where you would say like, okay, this person is just completely like a complete ideologue. I try not to do this anymore because it has not gone very well. And I don't have any reason to think that I'm going to get better at it. I think that the people that we need to talk to are people who are, maybe they're leaning one way or the other. Maybe they feel like they're supposed to lean a particular way, but they're not complete ideologues. Those are the people that we can move. And the ideologues will, they will change when the ideological fashion changes, and not before then. So I think it was Helen Joyce who said like, okay, well, we need to go around these people and get to people who haven't made up their minds and plugged their ears. Yeah.
There's a lot of discussion about this as a left-right issue.
Yeah. And
I'm curious about your thoughts about that. I don't see it as being quite that simple. And I also don't see it was somebody I was speaking with just the other day. It was Bruce Party, who is, he's from Toronto, Ontario. He's a law professor, and he was brilliant on this. I really enjoyed the way that he laid things out because it framed things for me in a new way. But when he was talking about the left, right, he said, there's not really two sides, there's three, because you've got the left, the right, and then the liberals. He positioned the conservatives and liberals as two distinct things, and then the left as a different thing right now. And I'm just curious about what are your thoughts on this as a political phenomenon?
Yeah, so I can see what he means, and I would slice a little differently. I would say the divide is kind of classically liberal versus illiberal. And people can be liberal from, any political orientation. This is an illiberal child of the left primarily. And the pushback to it is going to be liberals who are, whether they considered themselves conservatives or progressives or whatever before all of this happened, but that seems like a much more salient divide. Certainly than it ever has seemed to me in my lifetime. Although, of course, I think in the past, like, this, what is the salient divide of politics? Like, it changes all the time.
Well, I've noticed this, that, I had a conversation with someone else recently, and this is a person who is still identifying as a Democrat.
Okay.
And that's the left wing in the US. So the Democratic Party, I used to consider myself a Democrat. I've left that. I don't know I don't know where I am now. It doesn't mean I'm a Republican. I just am kind of confused about the playing field and kind of disgusted with a lot of things that I'm seeing politically. And, but comments that came in were like these two people, they're constantly referring to the left, they're apologizing to the left, they're still trying to ingratiate themselves, and
Yeah.
and my sense is that the left is going to slander anybody who speaks out against this stuff. And so there's just this very far in tail and then everybody else. And so to try to talk to that side, that as you put them, like the ideologues, I don't think there's any talking to them with nuance at this point.
No.
And it sounds like that's your sense as well.
No, I mean, can't really convince somebody that the earth isn't flat with reasoned argument. I just, but you can convince everybody else to look at the evidence.
Yeah.
And that's how I feel too. And I think, I feel like I'm in a very similar position to you politically, where it's like, yeah, I always voted Democrat, and I don't see myself as a Democrat anymore. I'm not a Republican. I don't really know who I'll be voting for. And that sense of just being, politically adrift. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a really common experience right now.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's definitely strange to be like, the things that I grew up with, and including some of the people that I, grew up with, and you think that these things will be part of your life and will have a kind of consistent place in it. And then there's this unbridgeable gap that opens. So, my parents were Democrats. I thought that I would always be a Democrat. I grew up listening to National Public Radio. Like, we would have it on like 10 hours a day in our house. Now, like many people, I'll play the NPR game, but that takes about a minute.
I don't know what that is. I used to listen to NPR, but I don't know.
Okay, I think a lot of people came up with this independently, like, because I was playing this game before I heard, like, Katie Herzog has talked about it a lot.
Okay.
My dad came up with this independently much more recently, where you turn NPR on and then you wait until they make something really trivially about transgender or race or something. Like, they make it about identity politics, and you turn it off, and it's the game is like, how long did it take?
Okay.
And the answer is usually about a minute.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so like, breaking up with NPR, I thought that I would always support places like, the American Civil Liberties Union.
Yeah. They've taken a turn.
Yeah, there were friends who I thought, when we're old biddies, we'll still talk all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. For sure. There have been a lot of breakups.
But a lot of losses, a lot of social losses.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of, like, I have a book proposal that is out right now. And it's, you kind of have to come up with this like publicity plan, which feels completely, it feels completely narcissistic on the one hand and completely just like pie in the sky on the other hand, because of course nobody's accepted the book proposal at the point that you write this, much less like you haven't written the book. Nobody wants to talk to you about it because you haven't written it, because you haven't gotten a book proposal accepted, but you have to tell them like, well, like maybe I would go on this, radio show and I would talk to this person. And it was kind of heartbreaking for me when I was writing that, to be like, okay, as a teenager, when I was stuck and I was writing, I would always imagine that I was being interviewed by like Terry Gross on NPR.
Yeah.
Because she asks like such good questions. And that would always get me unstuck. And as I was filling out this section of the book proposal, it was like, she probably wouldn't want to talk about this.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like an icon. That's
a tarnished icon. Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway.
Well, you're a phenomenal writer, and I hope you get that. I hope you get the book done.
Thanks.
It works out.
I hope somebody buys it. If you know anybody.
Oh, I'll buy it if you'll sign a copy for me.
Oh, I mean, like a publisher has to buy it first.
Oh, a publisher. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I hope
so
you
if
get
you were
that.
a publisher out there.
Yeah, no, I'm not, but yes, maybe somebody out there.
Yeah.
So speaking of writing, where can people find your writing?
Yeah. So I write on Substack at Eliza Mondegreen at substack.com. And everything that I write everywhere else, I also link to there.
Okay.
So that's
do you have any other recommendations or references you'd like to direct people to?
Um, I guess I've been thinking about some of my favorite people to follow on Twitter and like the people who I always read, even as Twitter continues to mess with the algorithm and make it impossible to like use the app. Um, I have really appreciated the work that Karina Khan and Lyra Sapir and Candace Jackson do, especially about US politics and the real mess that that is. They just, those people always have a great analysis. Helen Joyce and Victoria Smith, I always, like, I will read anything either of those women write ever. And a small account that I really love is the, oh, it's the account of an anonymous social worker, and I can send it to you and you can put it in the show notes.
Okay. Yeah, totally.
But yeah, this is a person who he just has such a depth of analysis of kind of what's going on like psychologically, what's going on within like the profession of social work, and also just a brilliant writer. Just so yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, if you send that, I'll include it so people want to check that out. They can follow that link.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is, an ad. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. And
yeah, it was lovely to talk to you.
yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leslie.